Welcome to this webcast, which is part of the LeadWire series on eating disorders. I am joined today by Stephanie Ng. She's a PhD student at the University of Hong Kong. Stephanie, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Alistair.
Stephanie, we'll be talking about eating disorders today, and in a recent paper you published, you investigated eating disorders specifically among young women in China. Now, over the past 30 years, China has seen a strong increase in the number of young women suffering from eating disorders. Can you tell us a bit about what has been driving this development?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to actually start by looking at the biopsychosocial model and to really just begin appreciating the complexity of eating disorders before we get into the nitty-gritty of why it is that there has been a rise in eating disorders in China. So for those of us who have studied in the psychological field, the biopsychosocial model will be familiar, but for those of us who are outside of that field, I'll just quickly go over what that is. In terms of when it comes to the pathology or the development of mental health problems, we typically see a convergence of different factors that come together. So we have, the biological aspects. For example, if someone has a genetic predisposition to experience anxiety when stressful things happen, that's the biological. I think of it like a Venn diagram, having just three bubbles that come together to create a pathology or create symptoms of a mental health problem. So if we think about the first bubble, which is biology, things like a genetic predisposition for heightened anxiety, that's the first part, for example. And then we look at the psychological aspects. So let's say that someone has a tendency to have perfectionistic traits or to have a high need for cognitive control. So they really think that it's important for them to be in control of a situation. And that would be a psychological aspect. Another one perhaps would be low self-esteem. So these are all psychological aspects that can contribute to the pathology or the development of an eating disorder. And then finally, we have those social aspects. Things like social media pressures, peer pressures. These are things that we typically hear when it comes to what people blame or attribute the reasons for why someone would develop an eating disorder. But I don't think that we often fully appreciate that all of these things need to come together in order for someone to be susceptible to developing an eating disorder. And so I think it's helpful for us to start in that way because when it comes to explaining why someone would develop an eating disorder across cultures, right, it's important to realize that no single factor will contribute to an eating disorder or can fully explain why someone would develop an eating disorder. So I wanted to start there. Also wanted to say that when you read the paper, you'll see that I talk about body image and eating disturbances, and that is distinct from a clinical level of eating or a clinically significant eating disorder. There is a difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder. And there are many nuances that separate the two types of pathology or difficulties, but a main thing is level of functionality and level of obsession. So if someone is struggling with disturbances to their eating patterns, let's say restricting their food intake or binge eating, these are behaviors that can happen in isolated pockets, which means that a person can practice them or engage in them in, not in a way that is continuous or that may inhibit the functionality of their daily living. Whereas someone who is struggling with an eating disorder will perhaps, let's say, experience crippling guilt from not engaging in a particular exercising regime, not eating in a certain way, to the point that they are inhibited from daily life activities. Let's say they stop going to work or going to social gatherings because they are so affected by the guilt that they're struggling with in terms of their eating and exercising behaviors or body image disturbances. So that's just the distinction I also want to make when it comes to understanding eating disorders and their complexities, because I think it's important to first appreciate that lots of factors tie into or contribute to the development of an eating disorder. And also there is a whole spectrum of ways that someone can struggle with their eating and body image concerns. So I wanted to preface the discussion about, why individuals in Chinese contexts may be struggling, because I think that's a nuance that people often don't appreciate when they ask, oh, so why does why would someone develop an eating disorder? And it's important, I think, to see that it's a very complex. These disorders are very complex. Lots of things and factors can contribute to their development, and lots of things can influence the course in which they continue to develop. And then now just wanted to go into a little bit more of an exploration of why it might be the case that eating disorders are on the rise in Chinese contexts. And I can't, talk about all the possible reasons why, and this is not a laundry list or an exhaustive list, but I do think that there are some major trends that we can kind of look at and start to put the puzzle pieces together. So what we see is that there is rapid economic growth going on in China, which has really led to certain shifts in the ways that the ideal, or quote unquote ideal, woman is portrayed. And there's a paper that I cite in my article by Jung in 2018, which I think really explores these shifts really nicely. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. And so I think specifically, and what we see, the two clashes of expectations, so to speak, between traditional and emerging norms for the ideal, the image of the quote unquote ideal woman, is that in traditional cultural norms, there would have been an expectation for women to be obedient and submissive and soft-spoken. But there is a growing shift and expectation even for women to be self-sufficient and financially independent. And so I think of course, there are different ways that a person could exhibit these desirable traits of being self-sufficient and financially independent. But there is a way in which that I think this is a global phenomenon in which the manipulation of physical appearance traits is kind of presented to us as a particularly efficient and straightforward way to present ourselves as someone who is self-disciplined or successful. And so, for instance, being able to control one's physical appearance through, let's say, showing that you can afford gym memberships, or you have access to knowledge about dieting. These are like, cultural currencies. Like, you are able to talk about dieting in a way, in a conversation, bring it up in conversation, or being able to afford plastic surgery. All of these things kind of come together to form the idea that being able to show up in a certain kind of physicality or show specific appearance traits is like a representation of self-sufficiency or financial independence. So that is kind of a shift that we have started to see. And also what we see from the literature is that body image and eating disturbances can be viewed as a way to exert control amidst unpredictable or uncertain circumstances. And so another way that we can interpret the trends that we see, the trend of a rise in eating disorders in the Chinese context, is that people might be trying to adjust to these sociocultural changes that are occurring as a result of the economic growth that we're seeing. And so another thing that we found out in our paper, something that was interesting, and what our main focus was that we looked at in the paper, was that struggles with food and body may represent a way in which Chinese young adult women are trying to reconcile those interpersonal and individual needs. For example, to show up as an autonomous person through controlling their food and their body and their appearance. And also at the same time to sustain those valued relationships that they have with family members, to eat everything that is offered at the dinner table.
You just mentioned there the traditional norms in China, so that young people should not waste food and eat more. That obviously stands in conflict with certain pressures to also uphold thinness or certain appearances. Do you have also maybe some recommendations to young women on how they should maybe best cope with these, what seems to be contradicting messages?
Yeah, absolutely. And this brings me to that aspect of one of the conclusions that we found, or one of the main findings of our study, which is that a contextually informed sense of self, which we talk about in the discussion, which basically means the ability to accept that we can behave differently across situations and still sustain a stable sense of identity. That is what I mean by contextually informed sense of self. When people are able to practice that. That led to adaptive, emotional, and behavioral outcomes in the women who described that kind of way that they could adapt to different situations and to behave in those flexible ways, depending on kind of the values that they were aligning themselves with. So I think it's helpful. I really like analogies, and this is a helpful one to explain what that meant in the context of our study. So it's like driving a car and being in the front seat and hearing lots of people yelling and screaming in the back, and then being very overwhelmed by that. But then understanding that because you're sitting in the driver's seat, you ultimately you're driving. No one can take the wheel for you and turn you in a different direction, even if their voices are really loud. So I think that comparing this to someone who is able to practice kind of the contextually informed sense of self is that they know that in that situation where they might be experiencing a lot of expectations from many different sides, they still have a decision that they can make that is value aligned, and they won't see their sense of self as threatened if they were to drive in a different direction, because that's just where the car is going. It says nothing about what they're who they are, or there's nothing about the person who's driving the car that doesn't just because you drive to a certain destination doesn't change the person that you are. And so again, in the context of the study, just bringing that back. For example, if a person or a woman, one of the women described how she would be in a family gathering and perhaps eat past fullness. And in that situation, she would be aligning herself with the value of relational harmony. She saw that as a way of being able to respect that situation. And then in the following, on the following day, perhaps she would make that decision to honor her autonomous side by, eating things that she preferred, or, eating in a more moderate amount. And in that way, she was respecting her value of being an autonomous person. So basically, all tying this all together, fluctuations in behavior did not represent a threat to the person's sense of identity, and thus did not lead them to experience that sense of guilt that they might otherwise have by how we tend to be like, oh, that kind of eating pattern was bad, and hence I'm a bad person. Just tying that back to our morality, I think that's kind of where it crosses into the disturbances in eating, or disturbances to the sense of self, when you tie that too closely to sense of morality or who you are. And just like going back to that framework that we were talking about earlier, in terms of the distinction between an eating disorder and disturbances in eating, or disordered eating, where there is an inhibition to a person's functionality, or there is a heightened level of obsession about your behaviors. So that's what we looked at and found.
And now, if you look forward, are you more optimistic or pessimistic that the trend in China towards more and more young women with eating disorders can be reversed?
Yeah, so I would say that I'm definitely more optimistic than pessimistic, even though there is, I know that the situation looks dire, and eating disorders continue to be on the rise. But I would say I'm optimistic because, and this occurs in the context of COVID, which is, I know that COVID has definitely caused a lot of devastation to many communities, and I don't want to make light of that. But I do think that COVID has brought about an increased openness to talk about mental health. And the reason why I bring this into the conversation about eating disorders and whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about that is because literature does say that disordered eating can represent our attempts to communicate suppressed emotion. And so in this greater context where people are able to communicate their emotions and to destigmatize mental health problems in more in the broader context, I do see and hope that people would be open to just be able to connect with other people in a more open way. And that would, this is in the context of all mental health problems, being able to connect and see yourself as not alone in this world where everyone has their unique struggles. That allows, and I think opens up the conversation and relieves a lot of mental health distress, or mental distress that people may experience.
And maybe looking just beyond also China, you know, there's people obviously suffering all over the world from poor relationships with food. And do you have some general advice, maybe some good advice for people that may be suffering from eating disorders that may watch this webcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a main message that I hope people can take away after watching this webcast is that disordered eating behaviors and eating disorders are really ultimately not about food or body at all. And I think that needs to be a myth that is debunked. And I want to emphasize that eating disorders and body image concerns are ultimately about trying to find a voice and feeling like you are heard and seen in a society that often overemphasizes food and body as indicators of self-worth. So that ties into that earlier discussion about feeling, opening up those discussions and seeing more connections than or seeing more similarities than differences between people in our lives. And I think that as the inherently social creatures that we are, it's really natural for us to want to find a way to feel acknowledged. And unfortunately, it is the case that our society has portrayed it such that the manipulation of physical appearance or controlling our body size seems to be the most efficient way to get there. We see those before and after photos saying that the before is less successful or less self-disciplined, and the after photos are more successful, more disciplined. So it's everywhere in our cultural landscape. So another main message that I hope people can take away is that if you are struggling with disordered eating or an eating disorder, it's, without making light of it or saying that it doesn't, I just want to emphasize that this is a way that you have learned to cope with your stressors. And this is a natural inclination that human beings will have to cling on to something that feels familiar and safe in times of uncertainty and struggle. So instead of facing yourself with a critical lens, replacing that with compassion and acceptance that this is happening and this is how you have learned to cope in your uncertain circumstances. Something that I'm a huge fan of, the acceptance and commitment therapy framework of it's ACT for those of you who are interested in looking at that. And basically, in a nutshell, this framework talks about how we can, instead of trying to change our thoughts and behaviors, trying to look at a way to accept those negative thoughts and still live a value-aligned life. So that's kind of, instead of looking at it from a critical lens or seeing your behaviors and thoughts in a way that is, in a way that, in a self-blaming or shaming way, looking at it in the lens of accepting and moving towards more connection instead of blaming yourself for what has happened. And a final note is that eating disorder message that I do want to bring forward is that eating disorders can affect anyone of any demographic status, any gender, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic status. And it's not something that only afflicts women, even though that was the focus of my study. There is an increasing amount of evidence showing that it affects everyone, and that eating disorders may manifest differently or show up in terms of different kinds of symptomatology, but all of these disorders can cause a lot of devastation to all groups. So that is the message I want to tie into at the end.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for taking the time. And I wish you all the best and good luck with your further studies. Hope to see you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair.